Wherever we find ourselves in moments of difficulties or problems or strife, it typically comes with a certain tension. And the recurring temptation, of course, when you find yourself in those types of situations, is to do something, to do anything to relieve the tension. But the gospel proposes something quite different. So to frame the issue, if you're a bishop or a priest or a deacon and you are conducting the sacrament of baptism, there is a particular part of the ritual called the Ephphatha rite, which involves the touching of the ears and the mouths of these little kids, these little babies. And basically, it's an allusion to the Gospel of Mark chapter 7, where Jesus himself does precisely that. He touches the ears and the mouth of this man who is deaf, who is mute, as a precursor to his healing, to his restoration. And the whole idea behind this particular aspect of the ritual is to convey the hope and the expectation that someday, one day in the future, this child will receive the fullness of the gospel and be able to convey that same truth with boldness, with bravery, in the context of evangelization. Now, I love this particular example because it really helps to convey this really important concept in the context of Catholic theology, this notion of the already but the not yet. And so the whole idea is that right now we are vested with enormous power, enormous potential, enormous grace, not just the grace of the sacraments, but also the grace of the present moment, the grace conveyed to us through people, through circumstances, through prayer. But for the most part, this grace, this power, this potential has not yet reached completion. It hasn't reached fruition. And so therefore, something needs to happen. Some manner of collaboration and cooperation on our part, for sure. But perhaps more importantly, some manner of patience, some manner of the passage of time, some manner of trust. Trust that what God has begun in time, he will ultimately bring to completion. Now, practically speaking, what this means is that if you're involved in some manner of accompaniment, some manner of journeying with, whether we're talking about as a priest or a deacon, a youth minister, a teacher, a parent, a friend, you need to resist actively the temptation to go the way of micromanagement, which is basically to say you need to actively avoid and resist the temptation to think to yourself that, look, unless I tell this person to do these things in this particular way, according to this particular timeline, this person's life will end up in ruin, and it'll be all my fault. But instead, you need to trust in the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is real. The Holy Spirit is amazing. And even right now, the Holy Spirit is doing something amazing in the heart of this person, most of which does not involve you. And so therefore, if you believe that, the question you're called to ask yourself is, what am I called to do right now in the present moment, if anything? To say something to this person, to do something in collaboration with this person to help move the situation along. And once that becomes clear, this particular mode of collaboration or cooperation, do that, say that prophetic word, no more and no less. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. So recently I was on vacation, and while I was on vacation, I happened to see this really great clip from this movie called Wonder Woman 1984, which is basically a sequel to the original Wonder Woman movie starring Gal Gadot. And so, just to make sure we're on the same page, Wonder Woman is basically one of the main comic book characters from the pages of DC Comics. And in terms of her backstory, back in the day before she went to North America to fight crime, she was a princess. She was Princess Diana in the context of this fictional island called Themyscira, which is populated exclusively by Amazonian women. Anyways, early on in the context of the film, Princess Diana is still on Themyscira, and she's this young girl. She's about like 10 or something. And she's running this race against full-grown Amazonian women. And initially, she's winning, so enormous power, grace, potential. But then, because she's young, she gets full of herself, she gets distracted, and she allows herself to be hit by this branch from this tree, and then she falls to the ground. So instead of leading the race, now she's practically last. But then she's so determined to win that she decides to cheat. So she takes this shortcut, and she's about to win the race, when all of a sudden her mentor, the general of the local army, grabs her by the scruff of the neck and pulls her back from the finish line, thereby allowing the other people to win the race. And at first, as you might expect, Diana is really upset, and so she starts to complain. And so basically what she says to the general is, I would have won. In response to which the general basically says to her, no, you wouldn't have won. You took the shortcut. You cheated. And that's the truth. And the truth is all that matters. You're not ready to win, and there's no shame in that. The only shame is knowing the truth and failing to correspond to it. No hero was ever born from lies. So, really great speech, in the aftermath of which she leaves, exits stage right. And then, all of a sudden, Diana's mother comes on the scene, the queen of Themyscira, and she realizes that her daughter is upset, and so she goes down to her level, she hugs her, she consoles her. And she refers her to this statue of this woman named Asteria, who's basically held to be one of their great saints in their local tradition. And basically what the queen says to young Diana is this: Asteria didn't become great. She didn't become a legend overnight or through haste. But instead, she became this person through true acts of bravery, patience, diligence, and the courage to face the truth. And then she turns to her daughter and says, look, one day, all your dreams will come true. And on that day, everything will be different. Now, obviously, I love that scene, but I want to make sure you get the point of it all, right? So basically, this particular scene ties together all these things we're talking about today. So certainly, yes, we are vested with enormous power, enormous grace, enormous potential. And we're called to do something tangible to cooperate with the growth of that particular grace in our hearts and in our lives. But the whole idea is that that particular mode of collaboration or cooperation doesn't necessarily involve what we might expect. And so you got to realize that whenever we find ourselves in moments of tension, or we find ourselves in the midst of the already but not yet, there is this recurring temptation to do something big and flashy to resolve that temptation in one big moment. But you got to realize that a lot of times that particular urge to do that particular thing is very much couched in anxiety and a certain distrust in God's providence. And so instead, what we're typically called to do is something very small, very hidden, something which seems very much insignificant. Some manner, for example, of corresponding to the duty of the moment. Where does the Lord want me to be? What does he want me to do? Do I have the willingness and the courage to correspond to the few things the Lord wants me to do carefully and well? Do I have this habit of prayer where I expose myself constantly to the truth? And do I have the courage to correspond to that same truth? And then finally, do I have an appetite for patience? Patience which in turn reflects a willingness to trust that the Holy Spirit is real, to trust that he is always up to something good and glorious and amazing, even though I might not know what that particular something might be. And to trust that what God has begun in time, he will ultimately bring to completion. And may God bless you all.